Hello, everybody, and welcome to Class 5 of Introduction to Corporate Governance. Today, we're going to talk about the boards of directors as a whole. Last week, we talked about the individual directors, their individual fiduciary responsibilities. Now, we're going to talk about what happens when they all come around the boardroom table together and how they act as an effective board. Let's have a look at the composition of a board. It depends on the needs of the company as to how that board is composed. It also depends what type of company it is. If it's a non-profit company, whether it's going to be a private company, a public company, or a state-owned company. So there will be legislative requirements as to the minimum number of directors. We don't want to have such a board a big board that it becomes so unwieldy, too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, around the table. But we also need to ensure that we have an adequate balance of skills and experience in our board in order to run the company properly and to deliver that strategy. It also needs to be the right caliber of people. If you think back to section 76.3, that subjective and objective test, we need to have the right sort of people around the table. King says the majority of the directors around the table should be non-executives, so people who are not dependent on the company for their day-to-day jobs. And there should be sufficient independent non-executives in order to meet the committee requirements. In the next lecture, we're going to go through the committees in great detail, but I have gone through some of the requirements for each of the committees. So you should already know that there are committees which require only non-executive directors, and then the audit committee requires only independent non-executive directors. So you have to make sure that if you have a company that is required to have an audit committee, then you must at least have 3 independent non-executive directors. When we talk about demographics and diversity, we need to think very, very broadly around gender, race, age, qualifications, and experience. It doesn't help if we all have exactly the same qualifications or an experience and we all have the same personal background. If you think about how big that stakeholder group of a company can be, you want your board to be representative of that enormous diversity in your stakeholder group, which means that you need people that came from different backgrounds, and you need people who have different genders, different races, and particularly age. I think that we tend to only go with these people with gray hair, but most of our client bases in a lot of our companies are going to be people who are substantially younger than our board members, and our board members may not necessarily know how that customer base thinks or operates or what their requirements are. So think quite broadly about what age difference can play. Also think about qualifications. When you have a lot of scientists sitting around the table, they will think in a very similar way. If you have a bunch of accountants and lawyers, they will think very analytically. However, a lot of boards internationally have found it quite valuable to hire arts majors, people with degrees in philosophies and literally in the arts, in fine arts, because they look at problems differently and they look for opportunities in a different way. So even something that appears to be unrelated to the company's business can add a tremendous amount of value. And if it's a listed company, there needs to be a policy in terms of diversity, particularly with regards to gender and racial diversity, but it must be broader than that as well. The nomination committee needs to review each of the board members, do the background checks. Remember that section 66.9, who is qualified to sit on the board or not qualified to sit on the board. And each board member must have a formal letter of appointment in order to sit on that board. And that's where we find those confidentiality clauses that are so important for Section 75 and the conflicts of interest and protecting the information which they receive while they're sitting on this board. And there's a little table of the different types of the minimum requirements for each different type of company. King talks a lot about board effectiveness, starting with the very fundamental basics of ethics and efficacy. So, in order to be a good board, it needs to be effective and it needs to be ethical. You can never make a decision in the best interest of the company if that decision is going to be unethical. So, what King goes on to say under that Principle 1, part of these recommended practices for supporting Principle 1 is that the directors should continuously develop their competencies to be effective leaders. So, in a world where things change all the time, and I think we know that well from COVID, risks that we never anticipated can arise, regulation and legislation changes on a regular basis. So, directors have an obligation to make sure that they can continuously be effective. They should ensure that they are ethical in order to give this effective leadership, and that the results of the strategic objectives and positive outcomes reflect that ethical behavior. So, again, you can't have a strategy which ultimately is an unethical one. If you've read some of the background as to Steinhoff, what it appears happened was it was almost a collective pyramid scheme of simply buying up companies and revaluing certain assets in in those companies, I beg your pardon, particularly the properties. So that balance sheet was growing and growing and growing, and it looked fantastic as a strategy, but there was nothing solid that underpinned it. It had no ethical basis on which it was underpinned, and that's why it collapsed. And that's kind of the reason that many in a simplistic form, many market collapses. The 1929 stock exchange collapse was also on the basis that prices had become inflated and there was no value. The 2008 financial crisis was driven by the housing market, again, which was also built upon a very weak foundation and a lot of debt that had no substance to support it. So, the manner in which the directors are then held accountable for their ethical and effective leadership needs to also be disclosed to the stakeholders generally. And this can be done through codes of conduct. Performance evaluations. It becomes quite important as to how companies report on the results of their performance evaluations. Go and have a look at some of the integrated reports and see if you can find companies that actually do disclose more detail around performance evaluations and where things have not necessarily gone right. It's quite a new reporting trend, so there aren't an awful lot of companies that do that, but that is the intention. Boards should also develop a charter, so we have a board charter that sets out its roles and responsibilities, membership requirements, how it conducts itself, its procedures, and provides a guide to its effective functioning. And that charter needs to be reviewed regularly. So, this is a document that exists over and above the MOI of the company, and it relates specifically to the board. And we're going to have a look at what it is that we put into our board charter. Let's have a look at Principle 6 around the board being the focal point and the custodian of corporate governance in the company. So King takes all of these principles that need to be applied, and it places obligation on the board to actually apply those principles. And where you find this sort of hub is in Principle 6, where it says the board should serve as this focal point. Specifically in the recommended practices to support this principle, in order to deliver this principle, the board needs to exercise effective leadership, firstly, by setting the strategic direction for the company. Secondly, by approving the policy and planning to give effect to that direction. And then thirdly, overseeing the implementation by management of that plan and that policy and to deliver that strategy. And then fourthly, ensuring that the board is held accountable for group performance. So the board develops the strategy, they identify what policies and procedures are needed in order to deliver that policy. They then delegate responsibility to management to implement that policy, and then they ensure that there is accountability for delivering that strategy, the board ultimately being accountable to the shareholders for that delivery. So in the board charter that they've delivered, that they beg your pardon, that they develop, they set out their role, their responsibilities, and all of their functionings and how they're going to go about doing this. There needs to be a protocol in order to ensure that members obtain professional independent advice at the cost of the company, and that the members understand the scope of their duties and can continue their professional development. And the board should ensure that there is a process for non executive directors to obtain information from the company going through management. Now, we will talk about access to information, but the principle is that a director is entitled to any information in the company. They're entitled to ask for any information. However, that can be a little bit unwieldy. Can you imagine if you have the non-executive directors going and asking the creditors clerk to see the debtors days, or the creditors days? It's just going to get unwieldy. So there needs to be some sort of process where they go through management, but the principle being that the directors are able to access that information should they require. Also think about that ability to access information in light of the business judgment rule, where directors need to ensure that they have become adequately advised and that they have taken reasonable advice. The board also needs to disclose the number of meetings that it's had during a particular reporting period, which is usually a financial year, and they need to confirm to stakeholders that they are satisfied that they have achieved their responsibilities in terms of the charter for that particular reporting period. Principle 7 talks about this importance of having the appropriate balance of knowledge, skills, experience, diversity, and independence on the board in order to ensure that the collective board can discharge its governance roles and responsibilities objectively and effectively. If you have a bunch of people who are all the same age with similar qualifications, who all went to university together and then all spent time in each other's homes, and they all belong to the same golf club, and then they all get around the table together, what type of objectivity can you expect from their decision making? I think that Steinhoff probably proves that there's very little objectivity. When you get different people from all types of diversity elements coming around the table, you are undoubtedly going to improve the quality of the debate that happens. So, in terms of those recommended practices for supporting delivery of that principle, King says that the board should consider the roles, responsibilities, and memberships of the committees holistically in order to ensure that there is collaboration between the committees, that there's complementary work in terms of overlapping roles, and that there is a balance of the distribution of power, and no one individual has this dominant decision making ability. So everybody has a voice and everybody gets to have their say, and that they get to collaborate where they have overlapping roles, and they all contribute to the quality of the decisions that the board ultimately makes. If you're going to invest this much authority in a group of people and this much responsibility, then it is incumbent on that group of people to evaluate their own performance on an ongoing basis to make sure that they identify areas where they can improve and continue to enhance their effectiveness. And that's done through board evaluation processes. So, Principle 9 specifically says that the board needs to ensure that 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 the performance of the board, its committees, its chair, individual members continuously evaluated. And then in terms of the recommended principles, that needs to be disclosed. We'll go into how we do board evaluations in one of our slides further along this module. So we then need to tell our stakeholders that we've done this evaluation, that there's been a description of how we've done our performance evaluation during that period, how it was done. Was it a formal process or an informal process? Was it done internally or externally? What were the results? What remedial actions have been taken? And whether or not the board is satisfied that this performance evaluation process is actually going to be effective in improving its performance. Principle 10 then also goes on to say that the board should ensure that the people that it delegates responsibility to implement the strategy are going to be the right people, and that that delegation is going to be done effectively, and that those people are properly authorized in order to deliver that strategy. So the board comes up with the strategy, they approve the strategy, and then they delegate it down to management to implement it. Management will include those executive directors, but it will also include those managing directors and prescribed officers and other senior people who are tasked with specific areas of the strategy. The board then needs to report back to the board, beg your pardon, the executives then need to report back to the board as a whole to explain how they have implemented this delegated authority, the strategy, and they need to report that ultimately onto stakeholders. So there needs to be a statement by the board to say that it is satisfied that it has properly delegated authority, that there are proper delegation of authority frameworks that promote clarity of the responsibility and the roles that have been delegated down to management. So basically, in a nutshell, everybody knows what it is that they have to do, what their authority is, where they can and cannot act, and when they have to refer something back to the board, and who reports on what. Let's look at the role of a board. So, a board, in order to be effective, must have certain components that it recognizes. It must be dedicated to ensuring that the company achieves its strategic objectives, and in doing so, that it is ethical and that it meets corporate governance obligations. And we've talked about those obligations and how they arise in terms of our broader stakeholder group. King, as we've discussed in our last slide, says that the primary responsibilities for the board are the setting and steering of strategic direction, approving the policy and planning to give effect to that strategy, and then ensuring the accountability for company performance through reporting and disclosure. So if you delegate down, you must report up, and then overseeing and monitoring the implementation of that strategy by management. The intention in discharging all of these roles and responsibilities ultimately is that once you have good corporate governance in your business, you should have an ethical culture, you should have good performance, you should have effective controls, and you should therefore have legitimacy with your stakeholders. So, those four bullet points are really the outcomes that we expect to receive from implementing good corporate governance from a board level. In order to maintain that corporate governance responsibility at the board level, where King says that the board is the central place for corporate governance, the center of responsibility for good corporate governance, the board needs to reserve certain matters for itself. So these are matters which it is not going to delegate down. So it can have committees and it can have management layers that actually implement certain tasks, but collectively as a board, there are certain things that the board as a whole must reserve for itself. Strategy being the first one, the development, how it's going to be implemented, and then monitoring performance of that implementation. Capital structure. So, our capital being our share capital, the number of shares that we have issued to our shareholders, and they've paid for those shares, versus the amount of debt that we have in our company. How much money have we borrowed from banks? And our debt to equity level, it becomes very important in terms of how we structure our company and our ability to run that business effectively. When you get to the financial management modules, you'll start to understand the balance of your capital structure in your company. But really, that needs to be a board decision. Financial reporting and controls need to be overseen and signed off by the board. When we get to talking about committee responsibilities, we'll talk about the going concern statement. And if you recall back to section 214, that ultimate responsibility for ensuring that all the financial information about a company is accurate and is not misleading, that sits with the board. Internal controls, particularly with regards to the levels of risk that a board is prepared to take on. If we're going to develop a strategy, we must understand the risks to that strategy, and therefore we must mitigate those risks through various mediums, including our internal controls. The board will ultimately be responsible for ensuring that all the processes and procedures as to how that company operates internally are properly managed. Major contracts, particularly where you have a company that engages in PPE type of tenders or government tenders where there's contracts involved, they've got to deliver a certain value of work. You find this in the construction sector a lot. So you would want to make sure that if you were going to have a contract that the company was going to conclude, you would want over a certain amount, you would set a threshold that must come to the board for approval. If it's just a small contract for stationery, things like that's fine. We can delegate that down. But major contracts that if we fail on this contract could actually sink the company. Communication with the public. We don't want just anyone to talk to the public. We need to make sure that the company speaks with a voice which has been approved by the board. They give a message that's approved by a board. Again, thinking back to that section 214 around misleading financial information, you definitely don't want somebody who's not suitably qualified or doesn't know the whole story to be giving information into the public domain which could mislead the public as to the financial state of the company. How the board is constituted and the membership of the board and its particular committees, that should be something the board itself decides. How the board is remunerated, how we go about ensuring that our remuneration practices are fair and transparent and reasonable. How we delegate our authority. We obviously need to keep that decision for ourselves. We can't delegate the authority to delegate authority. That would just be bizarre. Our corporate governance performance. Ultimately, the board is responsible for the corporate governance in an entity, so they have to make sure that they are the ultimate oversight of that corporate governance performance. And then any significant policies. These will be policies that implement the strategy, that deliver the strategy, that make sure that staff are able to do so, and need that board oversight in order to ensure that the strategy is delivered. Let's have a look at what leads to an effective board. How do we get an effective board? We need to make sure that we have the correct composition of people. So, this is going to be about that diversity of knowledge, skills, and experience. We need to consider the personality and the style of the CEO being the top of the executive management structure, and the chairman being the top of the board structure, ultimately being at the top of the company structure. We need to make sure that we have an effective chairman who can run productive meetings, that we have a healthy climate in our board meetings where proper discussion can take place and it's not an unequal distribution of power where we have one very dominant personality who simply just rules the roost. There must be a degree of common purpose, and it needs to be well understood as to how these directors deliver their roles. So the directors themselves need to really understand what their responsibilities are and their functions, and what the strategy is, and what the board is trying to achieve. It needs to be a group of people who can work together as a collective. This doesn't mean that we have to agree with each other all the time, but it does mean that we need to be able to work collectively together for achieving this common goal. The board needs to receive information, it needs to understand how it gets its information, and it needs to agree in what form this information comes. If you've worked in a company secretarial department, you might have seen old fashioned paper board packs where we frantically collect documents together the day before the board meeting, and we distribute these papers to the board and we expect them to read 100 pages in a day. Or you might have had the advantage of working for a company that has a digital system and is maybe a little bit more organized, and documents get uploaded into a digital platform which is viewable, and directors have a lot more time to view their papers. We need to make sure that each of these directors have the ability to focus on the substantive issues which are going to add value, particularly if you think about non executive directors who are not in the company all the time. They may not necessarily know what the substantive material issues are. They may have a broad idea, but the CEO and the CFO will be the people who work on a day to day basis in the company, and they understand and they identify risks, and they understand where areas of concern, of substance for the board, and they must focus the board's information delivery on those areas. We've talked about having competent non executive directors with diverse skills, remembering that when you think about a competent non executive director, this is somebody who's going to be measured against that Section 76.3, the subjective and the objective rules. The board procedures and rules must be well understood. So each of the board must understand what is in the charter and how authority is delegated, and then each of the committees must understand their role and responsibility. The information which flows to the board from company up to the board must be accurate, it must be complete, and it must be timely. We will spend a bit of time talking about that. Effective management team must be in place to implement the instructions from the board. So once the board has delegated down authority to deliver a certain task, they must deliver it to an effective management team who actually can perform that function. And then they have an obligation to report back to the board on the progress that they've made. The committees of the board must obviously be well constituted and properly run. So we have to think about which members of the board sit on which committees. There must be clear channels of communication, trust, and understanding between the board and the CEO, and then the CEO on to management. So there's a little chain of communication. There must be good systems of risk management and control, and those risk management and control systems must operate in a combined manner, so that they're not operating in isolation, they're actually overlapping with each other. And we call this the combined assurance process, which we will talk about when we talk about audit committees. The board will also have other types of responsibilities that come to it. Obviously, compliance with laws and regulations. You'll remember from King, the board must ensure as a minimum that it is in compliance with laws and regulations. The board must agree a process for ensuring that it has access to all the information and records and that it needs, that there is a procedure for directors to obtain independent advice. So this is going and finding a lawyer or an independent accountant who can assist the directors, thinking back to our business judgment rule and their fiduciary duties in that regard. The board must be able to decide the number of directors that will be required to make it effective, how it goes about monitoring its key risk and key performance areas, how it manages and oversees non-financial aspects of the business. We tend to get very caught up in our earnings growth and our share price, but we also need to consider the impact that we're having on people, on our communities, on our environment, how we record facts and assumptions that we use in order to make very important business decisions, such as going concern statements. How do we know that the company is going to remain in business for the next 12 months, which is the content of a going concern statement? We need to be able to record those facts and assumptions on which we base that belief. We need to be able to explain the effects of all the resolutions that we propose to shareholders. So if you go and have a look at a notice of AGM, you will see the resolutions are all set out, and underneath each resolution there's a little explanatory note, and that's where the board then explains the consequences of implementing that particular resolution to shareholders. We must encourage shareholders to attend shareholder meetings, which are referred to as general meetings, in order to exercise their rights, voice their concerns, engage with management. Ultimately, responsibly, shareholders have delegated down this responsibility to look after the company to this board, so they should be given the opportunity to ask questions. So it's kind of like when the teachers encourage you to attend parent-teacher conference, which I absolutely hate doing, but it's exactly the same thing. And then the board must also ensure that the chairs of the audit and remuneration committees, and the as many of the other board members actually attend the shareholders meetings, so that the shareholders can engage with those directors. But definitely the chairs of the audit and remuneration committees should be in attendance at board meetings. Let's have a look at what the board charter will entail. Strategic plans, monitoring the operational performance, and monitoring the performance of management, and determining the policies and procedures. Those 4 bullet points relate specifically back to that principle 6 of King, around that very specific role of the company in terms of setting and steering the direction of the company. Then, in order to ensure that those 4 bullet points can be discharged, risk management, internal controls, and communication policies become very important. How do we select the number of people on our board? How do we make sure that when these people are joining our board, they can actually add value as quickly as possible? How do we continue to ensure that we're doing a good job by evaluating our performance? And how do we determine the balance between governance constraints and entrepreneurial performance? I'm going to just hover on this for a little bit. So, corporate governance, critically important. We've talked about all of the rules that are made up of legislation, regulation, ethics, codes, policies. Very, very important things to do. But at the same time, we don't want to become so consumed in rules that we forget to actually run our business, and we actually can no longer run our business because we're so busy reporting and we're so busy trying to follow rules that we actually don't run the business. So that entrepreneurial performance is very important, to not be squashed by our corporate governance structures. So we need to make sure in our board charter that we keep that balance maintained. Let's talk about how information flows to the board. Just reflecting back again on section 76, 4 and 5, which talks about the business judgment rule. Directors can rely on the business judgment rule if they made sure that they were properly informed of their duties, and they were properly informed of the decision that they were going to make before they took it. So, the first concepts around the flow of information to the board started in the UK, and there's a nice description of that in the UK's Financial Reporting Council standards, which says that the board should be supplied with information in a timely manner, and that information should be in a form and of a quality which is appropriate to enable directors to discharge their duties. The key requirements for good information in order to ensure that good decisions are made: it must be timely, it must be accurate, and it must be relevant. It doesn't help if it's 6 months old. It doesn't help if it's wrong. And it doesn't help if it doesn't deal with the substantive issues that are relevant to the company. As I've mentioned, there is no restriction on the information which a board can request. Any director can request any information. And we see this in Section 66 of the Companies Act, which says that the directors have the authority to exercise all the powers of the company, which means that they have this ability to request this information. King 3 elaborated in part of those 76 principles that they had, that the board has unrestricted access to all the company's information, records, documents, property, management, staff, subject, however, to some kind of a process that is established by the board. So, whilst they do have a right to the information, that could become unwieldy, and therefore it would be useful to have a policy to decide how we go about getting that information. Remembering that it's important for a director to discharge their fiduciary duties, they need this information if they are going to discharge those fiduciary duties. If we think back to Section 76 2b, the duty on directors to communicate information to the board, unless it is immaterial or confidential, means that the directors themselves have a positive duty to share information with the rest of the board that they themselves may have. Directors must also obtain information externally to the company. So we expect our directors to remain up to date in terms of markets, industries, economies, key stakeholder interests, remaining up to date in order to ensure that they can make effective decisions. We must then balance that again with the risk of overloading our directors with information so that they become so overloaded. There's like a pile of 200 pages. They are going to miss the stuff that's important. And don't put anything irrelevant in front of them, because you don't want to distract them. You want them to be able to make good focused decisions. So we need to consider the amount of information we give to our board and the nature of that information. And at this in this point, I often like to say, we invest in these software programs where we have digital board packs, and that's great if that works for your director. But I have a lot of directors who really are quite elderly people, and they prefer to get it on paper, and they also tend to struggle with reading on a screen. So if you have a director who's really very, very good at his job, but you don't give him the information in a process or in a format in which he can consume it, it doesn't help him. So make sure that you give that information in a way that suits those directors. There should be regular updates and information going to the board, remembering that your board is going to be constituted of non-executive directors. They're not always going to have day-to-day access and engagement with the board, so they may not necessarily always know what information is available. Sometimes they only receive information on a quarterly basis when they meet, and therefore it's useful to send them flash reports, monthly reports on the financials, just so they've got some updated information. And then make sure that you circulate that information in sufficient time for the directors to make a proper decision. You can't send this information to a director the day before the board meeting, ask them to study it, and then make a good decision. Most board charters require information to be circulated to the board at least 5 days beforehand. If you can extend that to a week, it makes it helpful. Of course, you don't want to extend it too long, because then the information actually becomes dated and it's no longer accurate or relevant because it's out of date. But you do want to make sure that your directors have enough time to consume and deliberate on that information so you get good quality decisions. Let's talk about board deliberations and the quality of deliberations. So, we know already from Section 76 that directors must not allow their discretion to be fettered by some sort of um, anything that might fetter their discretion, but particularly with regards to a shadow director, some external outside influence. Directors should be able to contribute constructively to board decisions. We should ultimately try and achieve an agreement on all issues. So we hash out an issue and we collectively agree on the matter, and we all agree that it's in the best interest of the company to do something. In the process of getting to that point of agreement, we might need to go through quite a bit of disagreement, considering other people's points of view and opinions and other people's experience, which means that each of these individual directors needs to have the strength of character to ask questions, to interrogate the information that they are given, to not be afraid of being kind of the devil's advocate, or maybe not being all chummy all the time. They should have the strength of character, not necessarily to follow the crowd, and they must be able to engage in an argument. We don't want people who hide under the table simply to avoid an argument and just to keep the peace. Where it is necessary, however, it might happen that a director still does not agree with the board decision. So it goes to a vote. Say you've got 10 directors and 8 say yes and 2 say no. That's fine. That does happen. At the end of the day, we can't fetter the discretion of those other 2 directors. If they really believe that this decision is not in the best interests of the company, then they must not be compelled to agree with something that they don't think is right. That would be a breach of their fiduciary duties. So if they vote against something, they must let their views be known and they must be minuted. It is particularly important that boards avoid dominant personality syndrome, where you have a CEO or a chairman who has got such a big personality, such a dominant personality, that they squash the views of the other directors, or they don't allow directors to engage constructively in discussions, and there is a fear environment. And that's when you start to see unhealthy board decisions happening, token directors, and fettered discretion happening. Directors not acting in the best interests of the company. So, in order to ensure that there is always this balance and objectivity that will create good discussion at board level, we need to make sure that no one individual has excessive powers. So, we don't give all the authority to one person. This is very useful to have non executive directors around because they tend to balance out the interests of executive directors. And if the majority of those non executive directors are independent, it gives even more weight, to counterbalance, shall we say, to that excessive type of authority that the executive directors may have, given that they're involved in the day to day operations of the business. So the more non executives you have, the more you have the ability to interrogate the decisions and the information that is placed before you by the executive directors. We don't always get along, and people are different, and it is perfectly fine to engage constructively, to dissent and disagree with each other, as long as you don't fetter somebody else's ability to act on their own discretion. Conflicts of interest need to be managed properly, they need to be disclosed. And where this doesn't happen, where we have conflicts of interests which are not disclosed and not properly addressed, or we have directors who are fettering their discretion by allowing themselves to be subjected to external powers, such as by shadow directors, or simply just out of fear, not speaking, not engaging with the board, not actively debating, then we start to have an unhealthy board. Where this happens, we might need to get some help in, either internally or from more likely from an external, an independent professional advice to come and assist. And this might come out through a performance evaluation, and quite often company secretaries perform a very valuable role in making sure that this balance remains on a board where directors do have a voice. Non-executives and executives may often have common concerns around completeness of information or the accuracy of information provided. Non-executives may sometimes believe that the information they're being provided by the executive directors is not accurate, in which case they need to interrogate that in order to rely on the business judgment rule. Where differences of opinion arise, it is important to ensure that those differences of opinion are addressed in a logical and transparent manner. We need to set our emotions aside and our personal preferences and really think about these things logically, and then be transparent about the reasons why there might be a difference of opinion, such as a conflict of interest. We need to make sure that all the appropriate and accurate information is provided. It doesn't help if we're trying to make a decision based on bad information and we dissent over that. We need to make sure that there is no misinterpretation that has happened. So we're not making a decision based on an incorrect assumption. And if there is a very technical issue that we don't understand, then we must ask for advice. Think again back to the business judgment rule and that requirement to interrogate information and to rely on professional advice. So, this happens quite frequently with regards to IFRS, with the International Financial Reporting Standards. And if any listed companies, all listed companies have to apply with IFRS, and it's very technical and it's very difficult to understand. So it's important that when a board signs off on the financials, they actually understand how those IFRS requirements have been implemented, and they may then need to take professional advice in order to do so. If you do have a situation where we now need to put something to a vote, we don't all agree, so now we're going to vote on a matter unless the board charter says otherwise, in which I can't begin to imagine a system where it wouldn't be anything other than a majority, so 50%. The chairman may have a deciding vote, but only if the MOI gives them that authority. The Companies Act no longer automatically gives the chairman a deciding vote. The MOI must actually provide for that deciding vote. If you have dissenting directors, they may go along with the decision. They may say, okay, fine, I dissent. I would like my dissent to be noted in the minutes, but we continue as a board. They may find that it is so extremely um, different, the dissent is so extreme that they need to resign from the board. Where it becomes very sensitive and where you do start to see dissent likely to happen is any issue that requires the solvency and liquidity test to be applied. This is Section 4 of the Companies Act, where any money that is going out of the company, not in the ordinary course of business, so in instances like where money is being loaned to a director or money is being paid to shareholders in the form of a dividend, or there is a share buyback happening, and the company does not firstly apply the solvency and liquidity test, or the company will not be solvent and liquid once it has made this distribution or this payment, then that board, those directors can be held personally liable for the debts of the company, for the damages that the company suffers as a consequence of making that distribution. If a director dissented and said, no, I do not vote, I do not approve this, I will not support this decision, then those dissenting directors will be able to avoid personal liability for those damages. So it is very important that if they really feel that the solvency and liquidity test has not been met, that they vote against the decision to make the distribution, and that is minuted. In terms of dealing with dissent, where we don't always agree with each other, the chairman has a particularly important role. So the chairman must ensure that contrary views are always given a proper airing. Everybody gets an opportunity to explain why they dissent. All the relevant facts are available to the board, so nobody is acting on a misunderstanding. That everyone is clear as to what the decision is that needs to be taken and why we are disagreeing. What is the nature of this disagreement? There is obviously no agreement or no decision that can be made that is contrary to the law or contrary to the company's code of ethics, i.e., you cannot make an unethical or unlawful decision which will be in the best interest of the company. Where necessary, the chairman should ensure that professional advice is brought in. And then, when necessary, we need to put things to a vote on the board with the majority of views being respected. If there's not sufficient information to make a good decision, the chairman should actually say, hang on a second, let's just stop this right here. Go back, Mr. Executives, and go and bring us better information so that we can make an informed decision. Where dissenting positions are made, these need to be communicated professionally in an unbiased way and with an appropriate degree of transparency. And that can include where somebody is resigning as a consequence of a dissenting decision. The chairman needs to oversee that these things take place. Let's have a quick look at the board of directors collectively in this little slide as to what their broader responsibilities are. Establishing policies across the company that are going to support the delivery of that strategy. Explaining the company's performance to its shareholders, that accountability. Determining on dividends, which will be that return on the investment to shareholders. Approving annual budgets. If you're going to deliver a strategy, you need to pay for it. How are you going to pay for your strategy? Through your budget. Appointing and supporting the decisions of the CEO, and making sure that your CEO is available, and if anything happens to your CEO, that there is somebody else in the background to take over that position. That your top executives are appointed appropriately or dismissed if they are not performing. And then ensuring that those executive managers are all remunerated in a way which is fair, reasonable, and transparent. Here's another little slide which should just help you with the role of the board. So if you think back to that principle 6 in King, where we talked about setting and steering the company through the strategy, ensuring that is executed, ensuring that there is management available to execute it, and then to ensure that there is always a transition between board members so that strategy is not hampered in any way should board members leave. It's about impact, oversight, and succession. So it's all this is just a summary slide of all the roles coming together. Let's have a look at succession planning in particular. So we have this executive in the form of the CEO and the COO and the CFO. We also have our chairman, who will probably be non-executive, and all our committee chairmen. We have our managing directors, who might be prescribed officers of the company. And we have all these key operational positions. And what happens when that individual human being can no longer fill that position? Oh dear, they had a critical role to play in how that strategy was delivered, and now they are no longer there. What are we going to do? We can't deliver our strategy without them, so we need to make sure that the strategy is not going to be hampered by firstly making sure that there is always an emergency appointment. So our CEO gets hit by a bus, somebody can still sign off checks, and that there is somebody in the wings who can step up if the CEO gets a better job offer and or if he goes to another company, who will now be the CEO of this company. It's important for the board to ensure that there is a process in place for identifying suitable candidates for those permanent and emergency positions, ensuring that there's sufficient capacity, planning, and resources that are committed to ensuring that long term replacements can be made so people are being trained and mentored up into these positions. These succession plans need to be reviewed periodically and updated depending on who these successors are, how far they are in their succession plan, what the strategy of the company is, what the risks are that the company is facing. In considering the succession plan for the board also needs to consider how the strategy might change over time, and therefore, if there is a change in skills or experience and diversity that might be required. So, you might have a company which predominantly focused in a certain area of business, say in telecommunications, but you might have noticed that a lot of telecommunications companies are now branching out into what is called fintech, which is financial technology, which is things like we are going from making telephones to making SIM cards in telephones. Now we're putting those SIM cards into data driven devices like credit card machines, and suddenly we found ourselves playing in a financial services sector. Oh dear, we've got a bunch of telecommunications people on our board, but we operate more in financial services. So, as our strategy changed, so we need to have a look at how our succession plan is going to meet that change in strategy. Let's have a look at the induction of directors. So, this is new directors joining our board, either an executive or a non executive capacity, but generally in a non executive capacity. It becomes particularly important to ensure that that director, as soon as they arrive on the board, are able to start adding value as soon as possible. They're quite expensive to get non executive directors in, so you need to make sure that you get your bang for your buck. And also, probably more importantly, ensure that they understand the business so that they are able to discharge those fiduciary duties. Now, the chairman is responsible for ensuring that the directors are properly inducted, but it is often the company secretary who has to do the implementation. So, the induction process is a process by which new directors are orientated into the company, its products, its services, and how it operates. They need to be able to receive this information in order to add value and make effective decision making, participate in effective decision making processes, beg your pardon. So the company secretary generally ends up preparing a program in order to familiarize this new director with the company and its products and services. And this can include, amongst the information that you give or the processes that you follow, firstly, an outline of the director's fiduciary duties. If you have a relatively inexperienced director, say an industry expert, but who has never actually operated on a board before, they may not be aware of Section 75, 76, and 77. So you need to make sure that they understand that. Then all the information relevant to the business, the annual financial statements, integrated report, management accounts, any significant reports that will give them the information on the company, how it's performing, what its strategy is. The MOI being the Bible of the company, the powers of the board and the shareholders, the board and committee charters. Then you can also organize visits to key company sites. So this can be quite interesting, particularly if you have very operational businesses. In mining or construction, you actually put on your hard hat and your boots and you march all over construction sites and you go down mines with these new directors so they can actually see physically what is going on. I'm a very big believer in ensuring that our non-executive directors actually understand what it is that our employees go through on a day-to-day basis. So when I was in mining, I would go down the mine with the non-executive directors, and they would know what it was like to what conditions a rock drill operator might work in. So it's very important to ensure that they do understand that on a day-to-day basis. Then make sure that there are meetings with senior staff and management, major shareholders. They will ultimately have to vote to appoint them to the board through various processes, although the board will appoint them initially. In meetings with external advisors, in the case of listed companies, particularly the sponsor, who is is the company which is the sort of intermediary between the JSE and the listed company, and make sure that this director understands the listings requirements. Must make sure that the director is familiar with the environment in which the company operates, particularly if they don't come from that industry. So you may have a specialist accountant, but they haven't worked in, say, construction before, so they need to be brought up to speed with everything related to that industry. If you are in a listed environment, you need to be able to explain the concepts of closed periods, and if the effect of those closed periods, when directors may and may not trade. And going on to the next bullet point, the director's duty to avoid trading in the company's shares while they are in possession of price sensitive information and during those closed periods. What it means to be in conflict with the company in terms of a conflict of interests, how we deal with conflicts of interest, the need to declare those interests, and to be recused from any decisions that are made where there is a conflict, and all the listings requirements with relating to price sensitive information and the trading in the company's shares, and any specific training requirements that might be specific to that particular industry. When I was in mining and construction, health and safety was important, so all directors needed to be able to understand why they had to wear certain outfits and certain PPE when they went into certain mines or certain construction sites, and what to observe. You may not take your cell phone down a mine with you, which we discovered the hard way, those sort of things. You can put all of this together into an induction pack, which they can keep as a reference guide that will assist them as they go ahead. It's a nice little cartoon for you. You don't want to have a situation where you have all these board members together and the board members don't even know each other. So make sure that there's appropriate introductions. I have sat on boards where there's specific chairs in the boardroom that directors favor sitting in. So when you have a new director, please direct them to a chair that is not already favored by the chairman or one of the other directors, and then create some social awkwardness. So be aware of personal engagements and those higher emotional IQ, softer issues that sometimes come up on boards. In the last few slides, we've talked quite a lot about this concept of performance evaluation. If you're going to invest all of this authority in a board, then they need to make sure that they continuously assess their effectiveness and that they are prepared to improve in certain areas. So, King 4 talks about supporting the continued improvement of the performance of the board, the effectiveness of the board, by ensuring that the board evaluates its own performance well as that of the members of its committees, its chair, and individual members of the board. The chairman's performance is usually evaluated by the lead independent director, and the board should be responsible for determining how these performance evaluations are going to be conducted. Typically, the actual nitty gritty work of assessing the options that are available to boards for performance evaluations will be delegated to the nomination committee, who will consider the various pros and cons, the costs involved, and will then make a recommendation to the board. But the board is ultimately responsible for how that evaluation is going to take place. King recommends that a formal evaluation process take place at least once every 2 years. So, once every 24 months, we have some sort of formal evaluation. The board deliberates on how it is that that should take place. And then, in the year where there is no formal evaluation taking place, the board then uses that time to implement improvements from the last evaluation, and discuss its performance, particularly also that of the chair and the committees and the individual members, to make sure that those improvements are being implemented. Performance evaluations can be done in various ways, and the board needs to consider which is going to be the most suitable method for that particular board. Now, you can do them internally, where you maybe circulate a questionnaire. It's a very popular method. I use it quite frequently. It can be quite effective, and it can also be targeted in terms of the questions that you put into those questionnaires. And it can be very cost effective because you don't need to get an external person to come in and conduct the evaluations. Sometimes, however, it becomes important to get an external person in to do the evaluation, particularly if you have a problematic board where you might have dominant personalities and people are a little bit afraid to speak out. So, then having an independent person come in can be quite helpful. As long as there is a formal process that exists and that the board has agreed to that, the evaluations can be conducted in a manner that suits the board. Informal evaluations can be conducted by the chair, who may hold discussions with each of the board members, the proverbial have a cup of tea, and assess their own views on a one to one basis. In a personal discussion, lots more information can come out, particularly if it's in a safe environment, and the chairman then can take that information, synthesize it, perhaps make it a little bit more discreet and a bit confidential, and then distribute it to the board. The results of the evaluation must be reviewed by the board, and any potential shortcomings must be identified and improved upon through implementation plans. And then these implementation plans must be monitored to ensure that they actually are put into effect. So, if the board identifies a very common one that they identify is that they don't receive the right type of information, or that the information comes to them without sufficient time for them to assess that information adequately, so a better process around board reporting needs to be put in place. And then on an ongoing basis, that needs to be monitored to ensure that that improvement remains on track. The chair is ultimately responsible for assuming this role of the evaluation process, but the company secretary plays a very active role in terms of the paperwork behind ensuring that these performance evaluations actually do take place, that the implementation plans are put into effect, that in alternate years where there is no formal evaluation, that there are still discussions that are taking place around performance, making the recommendations as to what will be the most suitable formal process that the board can conduct, ensuring that the results are reported to the board, and that those implementation plans are developed and monitored. The The board should then disclose to shareholders and to its general stakeholders, firstly, that these performance evaluations were conducted, how they were conducted, what areas of responsibility were evaluated, so the board, the chair, the committees, etc., and then disclose results around those evaluations and areas where remedial action is required. Go and have a look at some integrated reports and see if you can identify companies that have been quite brave and explained in some detail where they require improvement. It's definitely an area of development and one where stakeholders are pushing back and are requesting more information. There should also be a declaration made by the board as to whether the board is satisfied that this evaluation process will actually improve the effectiveness of the board. Here is an example just from page 1 of a questionnaire, and it is a questionnaire that is developed directly from King 4, and I will make it available on Sakai for you so you can utilize it should you wish. Please remember that they need to be tweaked for your particular board. This is only for your reference purposes as a student, so please don't cut and paste my example and deliver it to your board as is. Please read through it very carefully and tweak and adjust as you require. It talks specifically about the six capitals in 1.4, so you're going to need to be able to explain this information to the board, but it is more to give you an academic understanding of what some of these evaluations can look like. And our last slide, which I think really illustrates the point. I have sat in board meetings where there's been directors that have been on this board for a long time, and you sometimes think, I wonder if this person actually knows what it is that we do. And this cartoon really did come home to me quite well. So please, when you go through director's duties and then you go through the role of the board, think about the role of the company secretary, think about corporate governance, think about how all of these areas interplay with each other in ensuring that ultimately good governance is supported and that value for stakeholders is ultimately there and everything is directed towards that long-term sustainability of the company.